So thank you all for coming. It's good to see you here. We're very pleased today to have Sophia Villenas with us. Sophia is an associate professor of education and the director of the Latino Studies program at Cornell. Sophia has a bachelor's degree from UCLA and a PhD from the University of North Carolina. She's been a bilingual elementary school teacher and an adult educator. She's an anthropologist of education who's worked with many of us here on the faculty and over the years, and we're very pleased to have her visiting us here at GSE. Sophia works on documenting the knowledge, values, beliefs, and practices of diverse families. She's done a lot of work with immigrant Latino parents, especially mothers, studying how they navigate parenting and schooling in new Latino destinations. I've very much appreciated Sophia's work. She, with a colleague of hers, Enrique Murillo, she coined this phrase, the new Latino diaspora, to describe the phenomenon of Latino parents moving with their children to locations in the United States that traditionally have not been home to Latinos. And they started to explore how it's really different in these locations. It's different to be an immigrant parent moving to a place like North Carolina or Maine or some parts of Pennsylvania than it is to move to Los Angeles or to Chicago or to Miami. And just as graduate students, they noticed this phenomenon. The 2000 census made it very clear that this was happening, but in the mid-90s, they were noticing this and doing research on it in North Carolina. That's work that has inspired me and many others who've tried to follow in their footsteps. Some of her most important work, I think, has been work on the educational values and practices, especially of immigrant Latina mothers. There's a tendency to engage in what she's described as benevolent racism, a form of paternalistic response to immigrant parents where, for instance, we set up parenting programs to teach immigrant parents how to parent, with the expectation that, of course, they don't know how because they don't speak English, and so they must not know how to parent. And Sophia spends a lot of time carefully documenting how there are very strong educational values and practices among especially Mexican immigrant mothers, and she spent time talking to them and working on those practices. And in many cases, the emphasis on moral education especially, but education of children to be whole people in rural, working class Mexican culture is much stronger than mainstream American parents tend to attend to. And so she was able to show that and articulate it in powerful ways. I also have always very much appreciated Sophia's manner. That I've interacted with her many times around research that I've done and research that she's done, and more than almost anybody I know, she's able to ask very difficult questions gently. That I very much appreciated that I can go to her and share research with her, and she will tell me what I need to hear about assumptions I'm making or misconceptions I've used, but she'll do it in a way that makes me feel good about the opportunity to rethink it, as opposed to making me feel bad about something I might have overlooked. So I very much appreciate that manner, and I'm very pleased to welcome you here, Sophia.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Stanton. It's been a pleasure to know so many of you here. I've known Stanton for a long time, and I know many of you in the audience, and also graduate students here at Penn GSE. First, I want to thank Dean Porter for inviting me here, and for the faculty members that took part in the Penn GSE Visiting Faculty of Scholars program, and making decisions to invite the faculty that you did. And I'm very grateful to all of the folks who worked on this program and getting me here today. And I'm very humbled to be here, and thank you all for taking the time to come and listen to this talk. And so I hope to gently ask some difficult questions today. This talk today is more of a conceptual piece, so I won't be presenting studies, but of course my studies and my research and my reading and my teaching inform this problem, right? I want to get out there. It's something I've been thinking about a lot as I teach, right? And people come to me to kind of translate for them who Latino families are. And so I was thinking about the tensions in doing that. And then again, just engaging in research with families, other families from non-dominant groups. So I'd like to start, let's see. Oh, here we go. So I often begin my multicultural education courses for teachers in training by showing this photograph. It's grainy. It's taken from a book. So this is a photograph taken by a reporter for a newspaper in Tama, Iowa. And so I asked my pre-service teachers, what do you see? How are you knowing others in this picture? Where does your knowing come from? How is the reporter knowing these Meskwaki children? Where does the reporter's knowing come from? How do you think the children know themselves and their families? Whose knowing is privileged? What are the consequences of one form of knowing over another? So following what is usually a very interesting conversation, I tell them the story behind this photograph. My colleague Doug Foley, who's an educational anthropologist, went back to Tama, his hometown in Iowa, to study race relations among whites and Meskwakis. In his book, The Heartland Chronicles, Foley tells the story of how he and his colleague and collaborator, Meskwaki historian Jonas Cutcrow, were looking through old newspaper clippings reporting on the Meskwaki community. They came upon an article featuring this photograph of two children standing outside the porch of their busy home. A bucket is overturned and garments are drying on the clothesline. The children's clothes look a little disheveled. The caption under the picture reads, "Meskwaki Indian children in the settlement near Tama whose eyes reflect the plight and despair of their parents." As Foley reported it in his book, when Jonas Cutcrow saw the picture, his eyes lit up. And he said, "Hey, that's my niece and nephew standing outside my sister's house." And then so Cutcrow and Foley had a good laugh. They thought the children probably looked bewildered, wondering what a white guy was doing, taking pictures of them with a big flash bulb. Foley comments to Cutcrow that the children's lives couldn't have been that despairing, since now they are both college educated and working professionals. So Foley's story and our conversations about it with my students, of course, point to this huge divide between the eye of the well-meaning photographer who knew Meskwaki families through the lens of plight, poverty, and despair, and how the families might know themselves. The point I make to my students is that it parallels the well-meaning eye of the educator who tries to know cultural others, and how families from non-dominant communities might know themselves. But this introductory exercise in my teacher education courses also signals to my students that I struggle with the tensions and contradictions of precisely, quote unquote, knowing, right, cultural others in their multicultural education course. Through my words, the selection of readings, and through our dialogues and exchanges in the classroom. At a recent community forum in College Town, New York, an African American parent expressed pain and dismay that teachers in the local high school did not even have what she called baseline cultural competency. As a teacher educator, I couldn't help wondering if I knew exactly what baseline meant in the way that this parent would call for me to know and teach. Certainly, effective teacher preparation and teacher development for a multicultural society require perspective and in-service teachers to develop an understanding of the interconnecting relationships between the home, community, and school. It should guide teachers to account for disparities of achievement based on race, class, language, gender, sexuality, disability. It requires prospective teachers and administrators to understand the cultural dimensions underlying the processes of teaching and learning, and how to work alongside parents and community members as advocates for their children. Effective teacher preparation and development aims to guide students to reflect and transform curricular and pedagogical practices for an inclusive, democratic, and multicultural society. However, the most elusive aspect of an effective multicultural education for a predominantly white, middle class, and female teacher workforce is how to think about the profundity of relationships and responsibility to other people's children, as Delpit has said. Yet one's own history in relation to perceiving or knowing the other is rarely elaborated in teacher training and development. how we engage in knowing cultural others has a powerful impact on both day-to-day teaching practices, educational research, and educational policy. One might say that well-meaning educators try to know other families so that they can help them succeed. Yet how we go about knowing, how we think we know, what the known think of our knowing, what we do with our knowing, are completely contextual, historical, and political. For example, how we know and talk about immigrants, Latinos, are framed within discourses of an immigrant America that welcome the labor, but most often not the cultural practices or the native languages. How we know is also framed by a geopolitical, cultural sense of first world dominance. The good intentions behind our contextual, historical, and political knowing may work benevolently when helping or addressing families' needs, but they may unwittingly involve us in reproducing falsely oversimplified views of other families' lives and concerns, while obscuring the historical, social, and political context of inequality. In this presentation, I invite you to engage in a very modest proposal, a modest rethinking maybe, or at least to wonder with me, right? How we as educators might think about knowing, how we might think about differently knowing or unknowing in our educational and research endeavors. First, I begin by situating my personal and professional life within struggles of knowing as a Latina daughter of immigrant parents, a researcher in Latino diaspora multicultural communities, and a teacher-educator engaging in acts of translation in a predominantly white university. Next, I explore how educators who try to do the right thing when it comes to fostering relationships with other families are often complicit in viewing families through a variety of reductive framings, rather than pursuing a deeper, more complex knowing of diverse families' lives. These reductive framings take the form of three dilemmas, which I'll discuss, three dilemmas of knowing. I situate these dilemmas within larger orchestrations of knowing, embedded in our society and its institutions. Third, I discuss both the promise and problematics of knowing through ethnographies that challenge deficit perspectives. And finally, I conclude by exploring how ethnic studies, and specifically Latino studies, Latino cultural studies, offer some possibilities for a radical or other kind of knowing within long histories, again, within these global hemispheric histories, while activating a knowing and unknowing that is always partial, on the move, yet ripe with emancipatory possibilities. So here I'll be referring to Latino families, but I'll be talking about, in general, right, what I'm going to say cultural others, which is the verb of othering families from non-dominant groups. I'm sorry, we'll go back. So if I begin with the premise that knowing is dialogical, as Bakhtin says, or consider the other and the representation of the self, which was the title of a session at AERA, the American Educational Research Association, then working to know myself has always been a relational process of sorts. This dialogic relation of self-other takes place on the larger stage of gendered and racialized migration, movement, and globalization. It also takes place within intimate and communal contexts of love, affirmation, and cultural integrity. I grew up in a Spanish-speaking family with immigrant parents from Ecuador. Let me change that, okay. In Los Angeles, I attended K-12 schools and local universities for my undergraduate and master's degree. I taught English as a second language to adult Latino immigrants in East Los Angeles. I grew up knowing myself through the monologue of dominant past and present voices of anti-immigration, English only, and racial silencing. And I can remember from very young coming home, being very young at home and my father coming home from work and being very terrified right, every single day that one day he's not going to come home from work because the immigration, at that time it was INS, the Border Patrol, the immigration folks were going to pick him up, right? So I grew up knowing myself through those lenses. But I also grew up knowing myself via my family's love, their memories of generations past, transnational stories of place, as well as through Latino voices of resilience and resistance aimed at talking back and rewriting histories of belonging. But the monologue powerfully negates a dialogue, and like other children of immigrant families, of immigrants or members of ethnic racialized groups, I found myself consumed with talking back to these present and past voices on terms that have most often not been my own. My journey in educational research has taken me to explore how Latino diaspora families settling in non-traditional Latino destinations come to know themselves in the absence of previous generations of Latinos. In North Carolina and now Mexican Pennsylvania, as I'm learning from Dr. Wortham, his students and colleagues, Latinos try to figure out how long-standing residents come to know them, how to respond to that knowing, and how to know themselves as Latin American nationals in the U.S. and collectively as Latinos who have been brought together through the economic and sometimes political necessity of migration. I have thought about how non-Latino host residents make sense of and engage in the process of knowing Latinos as well. I was and continue to be anxious about how local residents and very caring educators in particular come to know or understand Latino families' cultural practices and how these understandings shape the schooling opportunities afforded to Latinos. In rural central New York, however, Latino farm worker communities are invisible to local residents, unlike North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and other new receiving areas where Latinos come in direct contact with the host community. Rural New York Latino immigrants are highly visible as targets for immigration raids and deportation, particularly in the current years of record-breaking deportations. The politics of knowing Latino immigrants as visible illegals, in quotes, or invisible human beings who are isolated laborers with social, educational, and health needs greatly impact Latinos' efforts at sustaining their families emotionally, economically, and culturally. Latino immigrants' responses to the federal government's ways of knowing them is, of course, one of shock as they appeal for their humanity in their testimonials of inhumane raids and deportations. A Honduran woman, for example, told the story of her husband who suffered a serious accident on the job. And she told with tears, tears of not being able to believe it, but how the nurse wheeled her husband out of the hospital to give him to the ICE officials, the immigration control and enforcement officials. In the context of rural New York, what does my own knowing matter? My research knowing is transformed to one of not knowing, an impossible knowing, or to an unstable knowing, at best, as I ponder how to proceed, how I can possibly act in solidarity and with integrity. Similarly, in diverse and progressive college town New York, where I am leading a community service learning research project called Community Voices, I engage in knowing and being known in this community as sometimes white, sometimes Latina, sometimes of color. One of the leaders who got the name of a street changed to Martin Luther King Jr. Street. I sat near him at a community forum, and he talked to me. He asked me what I did, and I told him I teach classes about diversity and multiculturalism. And he looks at me and says, "But you're white, right?" So I said, "No, I'm Latina." So I'm very much perceived right in different ways. So how do I translate these experiences knowing Latino immigrant families and families of color when I stand before and among pre-service teachers who are overwhelmingly white, female, and middle class, or in the company of practicing teachers with the same demographics. I have worked as a teacher educator across 3 universities, teaching courses designed to prepare a teaching workforce for a multicultural and increasingly diverse student population. With every cohort of prospective teachers, my hope is, hopefully, I think that I'm challenging deeply held negative, albeit well-meaning, assumptions and deficit views about students of color and Latino families in particular. But I hear the same voices echo every semester. Their parents just don't care. We need to educate their parents. What do we need to know about Latino families and what do we need to know about their parents so we can teach the kids better? And this last question, of course, opens up the temptation to provide information about Latino immigrant families. Maybe this is the baseline cultural competency, if you will. I am actively positioned to teach about Latinos as if I were writing a book. Maybe with the title, Everything You Wanted to Know About Latinos But Were Afraid to Ask, or How to Know Latinos in 3 Easy Steps. But I ask, how do I translate both the generalities and uniqueness of Latino families? How do I translate the complexities, the contradictions, and diversity of a group of people? What are the costs of doing so across what often seem like epistemological chasms? Like most teacher educators, I too have learned the scripts and dilemmas of engaging students in ways of knowing other families. So I want to talk a little bit about these dilemmas of knowing. How then do we come to know families who are negatively marked in the larger society by race, class, gender, language, citizenship status? How does one see and serve families in our roles as educators, researchers, and policymakers? How might we be complicit in perpetuating reductive or oversimplified framings vis-a-vis our public service lens, right, in our roles, despite our best intentions? So it's not only the teachers, but it's myself, both in the classroom and outside the classroom, in the field, in the research field. How might we engage a more complex knowing of families' lives? So I want to address these reductive framings as 3 tensions or dilemmas. So the first dilemma, Latino families, knowing other families, Latino families, families of color, families in poverty, right, as all about experiencing oppression rather than also living lives of joy. So in North Carolina, with the establishment of a Latino diaspora, one stance taken by service providers and educators committed to helping their clients was a critical activist stance focused on addressing Latino oppression. This stance zeroed in on institutional mechanisms such as discriminatory practices related to housing availability for Latino families and other practices. To advocates and activists' credit, the effort was directed at changing harmful institutional practices rather than changing families, which is often the method and outcome of deficit-oriented perspectives. However, this extremely important stance also risked viewing families only through the lens of oppression, possibly ignoring dynamic facets of life affirmed by Latino families, and which ran alongside their needs, right? For example, addressing a particular family's overcrowded housing situation was certainly important, but a sole focus on the family through a need-based oppression lens, such as oppressive housing conditions, often did not make room for viewing how this family found comfort, warmth, and love in each other's company, how they affirmed their cultural integrity, and how they worked to sustain a viable family education amidst the concerns of how U.S. cultural values might negatively impact their efforts to raise morally educated children. That is, the oppression lens risked obscuring what Latinos found to be important, and how they work to define and create joy in their lives. In another example, advocates for Latino immigrants and immigrant farm workers in New York rightly and forcefully call attention to the record number of raids and deportations in the small rural communities of central New York. These are taking place most often through the violation of basic civil rights. Often children are left, when parents are taken, children are left unattended. There was a recent case where 20 children were left without adults. And so children were taking care of each other, right? So basic violation of human rights. Among the community of advocates, to speak of farm workers is to speak of so many needs and to abusive practices on the part of immigration and customs enforcement agency and the Border Patrol. Yet on one occasion, I was very surprised that these Latino families were also celebrating baptisms and birthdays. And I was reminded precisely on the occasion of attending a baptismal celebration after Sunday Mass in the community. In schools, teachers too rightly pay attention to children's lives and may work to mitigate the effects of poverty and discrimination on children's learning. Some of our efforts are directed at teaching others to take notice of children's socioeconomic and political circumstances. However, at the same time, educators may often forget to take notice of families' efforts at cultural and spiritual integrity. A scene in the teacher-made film Fear and Learning at Hoover Elementary, has anybody seen that? Fear and Learning at Hoover Elementary, about a school in Los Angeles. This film illustrates this dilemma of viewing Latinos as all about experiencing oppressions rather than also living lives of joy. This film follows Maida, a vivacious 5th grade Salvadorian girl, during the time when California was voting for Proposition 187, a law that would have denied undocumented immigrants the right to schooling and to health services. One of the opening scenes pans the alleys and streets of the Pico Union neighborhood surrounding Hoover Elementary in Los Angeles. The camera focuses on Maida's home environment of poverty, gang violence, crime, and illicit activity. We see a shopping cart being thrown in the alley where drug needles and used condoms are strewn, a prostitute eliciting clients, and men selling government IDs, birth certificates, and social security cards. But following is another scene of Latina mothers kissing and blessing their children with the sign of the cross, or giving them la bendición, as we say, as they drop them off at the school door. While the first kinds of scenes that I described, the illicit activities and all of that, are foregrounded throughout the film, certainly to elicit shock and to advocate for teachers' understandings and active response to students' circumstances, the latter scene goes by almost imperceptibly. And yet for me, the scene of mothers and children signal a whole world and lifetime of family love, of mothers' incredible efforts to protect and nurture their children, and to teach them cultural values of faith and family integrity, despite or alongside difficult circumstances. What might we have seen if the camera's eye turned to the beautiful grounds of the Central American Resource Center, just across the way from Hoover Elementary, or to nearby El Rescate, another center, to hear the conversations of everyday life? What might teachers learn if we were to witness family life and the rhythms and cycles of family birthdays and baptisms alongside the hardships? In this way, as communities of educators, we must work to change oppressive conditions for our children and their families, while at the same time embrace the diverse ways in which families create joy in their lives. A second dilemma is knowing families in conversations about needs, which unwittingly turn into conversations about lack, deficit, or what families lack culturally. So similarly, the second reductive framing in operation, families is all about deficits rather than also having assets, reduces families to their needs. But differently than the first dilemma, and more than reducing families to their oppressive circumstances, the deficit framing most insidiously conflates need with cultural lack. So while the first dilemma involves changing family circumstances, the second dilemma involves changing families. In North Carolina, for example, the focus became one of concern for the plight of people who were poor, non-English speaking, and non-US citizens. A concern that, although well-meaning, easily slipped into conversations about what Latinos lacked as parents and knowledgeable persons, and what they lacked in terms of language, right, English, and culture. So a deficit-oriented response of changing families rather than changing discriminatory labor, housing, and educational practices quickly followed. On the other hand, I listened to parents knowing themselves as culturally intact, sometimes even morally superior, in comparison to the perceived licentiousness of the US. In 1996, I reflected on my own complicity in a publication with these words. I reflected on my own complicity in this need lens as I was making my initial entry into this North Carolina community. So I wrote, so this is what I wrote. I remember accompanying an ESL instructor from the community college to the trailer park where he imparted classes. We stood in the grassy area in the middle of the park, looking out at the individual trailers, some with children and families outside them. The instructor was giving me the rundown on their living conditions and other problems. I was nodding my head, all the while gazing at the people who looked back at us. I ducked my head, painfully aware of my awkward position. It is amazing how this scene, and as I reflect on these words that I wrote in 1996, how this is repeated time after time in my encounters in the classroom and with non-Latino teachers, in classrooms with majorities of Latino and children of color. In these instances, as in 1996, my professional credentials sanction my knowing among educators and researchers. At the same time, community members affirm different aspects of my knowing, disaffirm and challenge others, while positioning themselves as knowers. The slippage from need to lack, however, is most apparent, I think, in parental involvement efforts. De Carvalho discusses how, quote, parental re-education is a necessary requirement of parental involvement, end quote. According to Chavkin, who cited in Carvalho, this re-education is articulated as a timely strategy to help minorities who suffer disproportionately from inadequate education, unemployment, and other social handicaps. Carvalho goes on to challenge programs such as family needs. Carvalho goes on to challenge programs such as family math, family science, and I would add family literacy programs, which quote, suggest a picture in which all families, but especially those in need of exercising these particular discourses, are talking math and science around the dinner table in particular ways. Practicing the language of power may be at the expense of other languages and cultural expressions. This need to deficit perspective as practice, programs, and policy make it difficult to engage in school-family partnerships premised on shared values, trust, and respect, and maybe upon different understandings of how education should be. And so let me go to the third dilemma, knowing families as a homogeneous and static group, or conversely as individuals devoid of collective histories, collective socioeconomic circumstances, and shared cultural practices. This third dilemma points to how educators struggle with recognizing what is cultural about families' lives and how to talk about culture, right? And the easy thing is to know Latinos in terms of an essentialized culture, or, on the other hand, kind of go to the opposite pole and go colorblind. That is, discuss Latino students as solely individuals. Our teachers and leaders in training struggle with talking about cultural practices that arise from economic, social, and immigration circumstances, and recognizing what is individually unique and different about diverse families and home ecologies. For example, educators might hold the view that Latina mothers who are undocumented and poor lack the necessary skills to parent without regard to both differing cultural practices, such as the cultural practices maybe of older siblings caring for younger family members as a form of family responsibility. So differentiating between that and circumstances of economic instability and family isolation from extended kin. In this way, I also struggle with what educators do with studies which show that children of the middle class from preschool age know more words, right? I mean, there are several studies about that. And very important, very good, important studies. But I struggle with the response, my educators, pre-service teachers' response to those kinds of studies. All of these, the way they're interpreted, inadvertently position immigrant, low-income Latino families as a homogeneous and static group with a less than shared culture, right? A deficient, somehow deficient, right? Shared culture, not enough words in the family. Latson-Billings critiques the poverty of the discourse of culture when it is used as a catch-all phrase to explain differences as deficit and to mark or essentialize any action or culture. And this we know is common practice. In both instances, the blame for disparities in educational achievement is placed squarely on the students and families' shoulders, even by educators who genuinely support educational equity and social justice actions. So just really quickly, just to talk about just our context of knowing and where I think where does this come from? Sarah Ahmed argues that, quote, the stranger is not somebody we do not recognize, but somebody that we recognize as a stranger, somebody we know as not knowing, rather than somebody we simply do not know. Did you get that? So she's saying, in the way that we recognize, we think somebody is a stranger. I mean, we continue to recognize that stranger, right? With our ways of knowing, with the knower's ways of knowing. So we recognize that stranger as someone not belonging. She asked the question, which knowledges are already in place, which allow me to speak for, about, or to a group of strangers? Ahmed and post-humanist theorists such as Foucault and post-colonial theorists such as Said, Fanon, and Sandoval have insisted on recognizing how our individual orchestrations of knowing occur within larger fields of knowing. That is, how historically derived ideologies and beliefs about other cultures circulate in the public sphere and through institutions. We have learned to know others through the historical relationships between dominant and non-dominant groups that have shaped how members of the former think about members of the latter groups, and then act on that knowing. For example, the academy has shaped the relationship between the developed West and the primitive others. We've gotten eugenics and the bell curve based on science. How we know others has been shaped by these historical relationships, or by historical relationships of colonization, of slavery, Jim Crow, etc. Culturally speaking, anthropology has contributed to social scientific categories that posit cultures in static, coherent wholes. This does not characterize anthropology or the way we think of anthropology, or we talk about it currently. But its enduring legacy of cultural construction takes hold. This is why Gloria Ladson-Billings' work, her book, The Dream Keepers, Successful Teachers for African American Children, I think it takes pre-service teachers as by surprise, because they always say this is not what's culturally relevant about all of the practices in that book, because they are expecting specific cultural traits to be addressed, from from the space of the academy, from social scientific categories. In the same manner, teachers' responses to diversity are often the words, "I can't teach about all those cultures," or funds of knowledge, or trying to excavate families' knowledge is impractical. If we're knowing through institutional roles and lens, and what I'm referring here is to the client lens, that's about responding to needs. For example, the social service providers, right, that the role of client, right, had them respond to the families in particular ways as filling needs. In a general sense, though, schools are all about categories, right? Gifted and higher track, lower track, and these categories, as McDermott and Varen note, disable students. Even teachers and social activists, organizers and leaders working with the best intentions to eliminate inequities can unwittingly perpetuate this divide of the known, the cultural other, versus the modern, right, creative knower. So I was going to give another example, but in the interest of time, I'll just go on. Another issue, the knowing through the discourse of practicality. What do I do on Monday morning? And of course, this is understandable. Educators are overstretched, overworked, underpaid. So the emphasis on the technical, right, becomes important. Just give me the handbook, or I need that technique, or I need to know that piece of information. But what about knowing Latinos as holders of knowledge, as intellectual, as teachers, as community members who are an asset? And this kind of, I think we're not allowed to have this nuanced kind of knowing. I think both from the profession and I think also from the institutions, the social science categories that reify. Like, for example, my husband Troy Richardson talks about how like the categories of hunters and gatherers, right? It serves to limit or to shape the conversation about how you can talk about American Indians, right? And so it's very difficult to have a nuanced kind or engage in a nuanced knowing in these contexts. So let me talk a little bit about the promises of ethnography, and then just examples, just very briefly, some examples of Latino educational research which has engaged these dilemmas of knowing. So ethnography, with its long-term engagement in communities and with families, have done much to challenge deficit framings of Latino families. And they describe Latino families' cultural practices as strengths and resources, as well as offered new conceptualizations of culture. And so in challenging, so this deficit perspective of Latino families was very, very, it was very much entrenched in educational research. And so, and it took the form of blaming families for the children's failure in school because of language and culture. And so this was very pervasive, both in educational research and educational practice. But the work of pioneering ethnographers such as Concha Delgado Gaitan, Henry Treva, and Luis Moll that work was very, very important because in the late 80s, early 90s, it set out to describe, right, family, cultural, language, and literacy practices and frame these as strengths. And of course, it set out to do that in the tradition of anthropology, right, using the same tools, which can be problematic. But this was good in the context of challenging the deficit perspective. Concha Delgado Gaitan, for example, described songs, right, and it talked about consejos, consejos which are like narrative advice, right. It put that word right on the map, on the horizon, that these are family cultural practices. Talked about literacy in the home, And then we also have had the foundational work of Norma Gonzalez, Luis Moll, and Kathy Amanto with the concept of funds of knowledge, which is based on the simple premise that people are competent, they have knowledge, and their life experiences have given them that knowledge, according to Gonzalez. We also have work, Tara Yoso, and who has published on describing what she calls community cultural wealth, right? Thinking about what is the wealth in terms of aspirations, in terms of language, in terms of family, in terms of the navigational skills, right? That families have to, they have to learn how to get along in the U.S. and there are a lot of skills that are developed. Anne was talking about this earlier. Yeah, these kinds of navigational skills. Where do you go for translators in the family and the community? Latino ethnography they've also helped us reconceptualize culture, particularly Gutierrez and Rogoff's work, where they talk about cultural repertoires of practice, right? To think about people living culturally, and not that culture consists of traits that people possess, right? You're Puerto Rican because you have these cultural traits, but rather it's about looking at how people live culturally, and I know, you all have expertise in that. But Gutierrez's work has been very influential with Rogoff. And then hybridity in the borderlands, right? Again, just opening up meanings of culture and cultural practices. And that, people would talk about our confusion and dilemma of going between different languages and culture. But from this literature, we talk about, wow, this is normal, right? There's nothing wrong with that. It's, we can do this. We do this all the time, and it's great. So Latino ethnography has given us a whole lot, right? Different ways of knowing Latino immigrants, in ways that they've challenged the different perspective. They've opened up a whole ways of understanding Latinos in terms of our strengths and what we bring to the educational setting. But we can also talk about ethnography is problematic. Many scholars, of course, and many people, right, have reminded ethnographers of ethnography's epistemic location and embeddedness in particular horizons of knowing. So again, Ahmed calls attention to ethnographers' knowing of strangers through the ethnographic episteme. She says, quote, "The process is one of exchange, of moving strangeness from one system of meaning to another," like anthropology, without altering its coherence. In another sense, despite outstanding reflective ethnographies, we maintain the discourse of the real because they are interpreted in larger contexts of university classrooms and through the lens of the social science. They're interpreted with other students, with other people. Again, in contexts that privilege the Western Enlightenment, that privilege technical professional knowledge. So this quest for professional knowledge is also the quest for the real. To our readers, if we can do more research, we can get at what Latino families are really like. And we can act on that knowledge to improve conditions. And I'll have to raise my hand and say, yeah, we need more research on Latinos. I mean, this is great. We're learning about consejos and these cultural practices. But I think we have to think about how is this call for the real maintained by dominance, by racist formations. For example, Anishinaabe novelist Gerald Visner writes about our complicity in the simulation of the real Indian. Right? So, what might it look like to know Latinidad on our own terms? The interdisciplinary and practical work of Chicana and Latino cultural studies intervenes with a kind of knowing that is complex and dynamic, a kind of knowing that emerges from the straddling of multiple worlds. Yet these interventions have not been without pain. In expending great amounts of energy to talk back to voices about us that dehumanize us, to construct identities of dignity, and to make sense of the collective pain, we neglected to address amongst ourselves issues of sexism, homophobia, and classism in our own communities. And so I have learned a lot from pondering these questions, right, from the field of ethnic studies, from Latino studies. I've learned how we have locked horns in addressing gender sexuality and the lived experiences of interlocking oppressions. And La Familia, the family, is simultaneously a safe haven and a space of oppression. I have learned from a field that struggles to know our decolonial agency, how we move and act in the world to reclaim our humanity, our knowledge, and well-being within modernist oppressions and postmodernist modes of sobrevivencia, survival and beyond. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about this ethnic studies and what I have learned from ethnic studies, just to end this talk and take questions. So ethnic studies responds to this quest by locating this quest for the real, by locating the call for the real in larger histories of racial formations. It does not go to the real, rather it locates it as part of this problem. These authors, the authors who are poets, right, novelists, short story writers, essayists, these stories, the stories they tell, locate the call for the real or oppressive types of knowing and the consequences of these stereotypes or modes of knowing within, again, those histories of colonization, colonialism, slavery, land dispossession, and racism. And it calls, and it does this by also calling an end to the structures that maintain the real. So not only do they locate it within this history, but they also, it's an act of calling for an end to these same structures. And so many stories I wrote here, a lot of stories here where you can't, even a story that's setting in the current time, you can't help seeing the history, right? Cindy Cruz talks about Jackie Alexander, and Cindy Cruz uses Jackie Alexander to talk about the palimpsest, the ways in which the current systems of oppression are, have its histories in the past, and you can see kind of the erasures on these papers, on the paper. Ethnic studies also engages in a meta-awareness of knowing the self in collective history. So not only does it deconstruct the call or the quest to the real and calls for ending the structures that maintain the real, but it engages in a meta-awareness or theorizing of knowing the self in collective history. So these novels, short stories, poetry, they play with the reader's sense of knowing the particular ethnic group. For example, going back to American Indian Studies, Anishinaabe writer Joe Visner, in his very funny novel ''Chancers," interrogates, not only interrogates what he calls a simulation of the Indian, as I said earlier, but he does so with many different possibilities, right? Each one, it has the reader guessing what is the real and not real. And he says that's an impossibility. Junot Diaz, Dominican writer, in The Brief Wanderer's Life of Oscar Wilde, plays the idea of the protagonist, Oscar, Dominicanness in Jersey and in the Dominican Republic, right? And so, so these authors play with that. They don't let us know, is Oscar Dominican? Is he, is he American Dominican? And of course, Gloria Anzaldúa shatters the systems that define who Latinas are, who Chicanas are, and again, doing so with poetry, with poetic language. I also wanted to point to this wonderful novel from Elena Viramontes, she's a Chicana writer, and she lives around the corner from me, and she's from East LA, so it's really neat to think that I'm living around the corner from her. Elena Viramontes, whose her early work was The Moth and Other Stories. But again, her book really is about characters coming to know themselves in this history, where they belong, and there isn't an ending that tells us who they are. And then, of course, ethnic studies has been concerned, and Latino studies has been concerned with knowing how to act. How do we act? Knowing our decolonial agency, and how do we act in ways that respond again to these histories, in ways that interrupt these structures, and in ways that emphasize the partialness of always knowing, but with methods of creating solidarity that do not depend on prescribed categories, right? And so Chela Sandoval is one theorist who does that. And in the end, Chela Sandoval says, well, ethnic studies, third world feminist studies becomes important because they're leading the way in bringing all people along to think about how we can change the world for the better, right? By embracing ambiguity, right? Part of knowing an agency, knowing how you can act in the world, is about knowing how to embrace ambiguity, right? Hybridity in many different ways. So just to end, and we can have a conversation. How do we approach knowing and unknowing in multicultural teacher education, research, and policy? Right? That knowing is tenuous, ambiguous, a continual process, but it's never arriving, and it's grounded in ethical and social relations. And I'm thinking back to Gloria Ladson-Billings' book, The Dream Keepers, a study of teachers who are excellent teachers for African American children, who actually come to the table knowing a little bit about their students, right? And so you can say, yeah, knowing students is important. But on the ground, they're willing to change and to be innovative, right? And to respond to both the individual, like the individuality of each student, and their families, and to know the community context, to critique the societal context, right? And so I ask you if it would be okay if we not know, right, as a way to engage in deeper, more complex ways of knowing. So I'll open it up for discussion. Thank you. Let me turn this before I lose it. So what are some of your dilemmas? No. Kathy.
Sophia, thank you for this. It was beautiful and thought-provoking and subtle, and it's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask a question that will contextualize this in a slightly different way in terms of educational policy. How do you think about when you're teaching, in working with future teachers, about the context that they're walking into with No Child Left Behind, or whatever the more recent iteration is going to be, Renaissance, where the logic is quantification, scientific notions of knowing, which is all about simplistic categorizing, the achievement gap, which labels all over the place and then tries to measure in relation to those labels. This is a completely and I think profoundly importantly, different epistemological stance. And how do teachers who will move on to embrace this stance live in that world where they're being measured and categorized and have to, in this world of standards?
And I think that's the first response I get. Like, we can't do this.
Yeah.
I mean, even that's, I think Stanton you talked about, that's the first response to the funds of knowledge. I mean, even for my students, no way. We can't go into people's homes and talk with them. And yeah, there's no space, right, to know people and communities with more nuance. Yeah, I mean, I think that all of that works against what I'm saying. And so, but we talk, I mean, teachers actually, bring that up, and that when we get past that, I can't do it. It's, it comes to what does it mean to do this within standards and within, teaching to high stakes testing as I work with secondary teachers. Yeah, that's a tricky one, and I don't know the answer except.
And maybe when I was thinking, maybe one way we need to teach in schools of ed is from this more philosophical epistemological stance, which looks at, the meta-analysis looks at these different ways of knowing that, and the background of them, and then brings them directly
together
as incommensurate. And so that there's a way that teachers can have an overarching sense of the ways they're being asked to know.
And so it's a meta-awareness of what is required in knowing students through this way, right, through NCLB or through those requirements, and what are the requirements for knowing through these textbooks, right, teaching through these textbooks. That's
so it's a critique.
And then I think also alongside of that, what other things are you doing to know your students? What kinds of knowing? I think what happens is that the pre-service teachers and acting current teachers become so overwhelmed with these ways of knowing their students that are imposed upon them that they. I'm very struck by your right, and I'm very struck by I'm sort of as someone who works with pre-service teachers. I'm thinking about how much I engage them in sort of learning how to sort of come to know and critique their knowing. You sort of. It sounds like you're arguing for those two things parallel.
And it's contradict. I mean, it's a tension there, and then there's the whole field. Whiteness studies and knowing, right? I mean, there's a lot of literature that talks about the teachers knowing themselves. Gary Howard wrote the book White Teachers, Multiracial Schools. He has this triangle of achievement. On one side is knowing yourself, right? The other side is knowing your students, and then knowing the practice. And so, he puts a big emphasis on knowing yourself, right? Knowing how you know, where does your knowing come from, and knowing how you are known. I know for me, that's. I'm working with some students in agricultural education who come from, agricultural backgrounds, and so we do a lot of autobiographical writing, but it's about knowing, for me, knowing where they come from. Or at least I think I know where people come from, often because I've memorized the scripts, right, and the responses. This group is presenting a challenge for me, and I don't know them. I don't have frames for knowing. And again, this is a critique of myself and the work I need to do. But it is important, to think about simultaneously knowing ourselves, how we are known to others.
This not being the NCLB context, I think a couple of authors have described their experiences. For instance, Gerald Campano, reading, writing, literacy among immigrant students, and also Cindy Ballinger, working with Haitian students. But I think, they kind of established that they were able to somehow fulfill the requirements of the school before they did that. But there also was in Gerald Campano's book the talk about the second classroom and really moving outside of the school day in order to do a lot of this. So I see out of school time as potentially a great opportunity to do this rather than in school at this point, given the politics.
Yeah, and I think in multicultural education they call for knowing students out of the school context and how important that becomes. And then I also talk about knowing, engaging in knowing through literature, literature is also a way to, again, not to know, but to get a frame for differently, what are the possibilities, right, of how we can know. But definitely a different context, right? What is the role of after-school programs or, knowing families and children in church or, at a local soccer game. Yeah.
As you were talking, I was thinking about how much this idea about knowing and not knowing and how you navigate that tension about, I was just thinking about it in identity terms as the knower, the knowledgeable one, and the not knowledgeable one. How much that's just locked into our conceptions about being a teacher and that teachers know
Supposed
things.
to know.
And then the resistant move from the student is often, but you don't know me. And then you have this sort of more principal district administrative level, you should know your practice and you should know what to do, and how difficult it is as a teacher to say, I don't know. In a system now where to not know it brings on all these punitive, because then it doesn't let you ask. You're never in a position, or you're frequently not in a position where you can say, I don't know you and I don't know what to do. And how there's so many pressures on all sides for someone to be the knower about, who knows what's right. And there are various people taking up that role at different times, but how the space to question gets narrower as the stakes get higher, because it's not considered to be education here. We can't not know something. We have to know what to do.
And so that's the way I had thought about it. Our institutional roles and our lens, right, as teacher, that's our job, is to know.
Yeah.
And then fill up other people with the knowledge that we know. And then, we're saying as a professional, we've got to know our stuff. And it is becoming very punitive.
Yeah.
There's, like you're saying, no room for that reflection.
Yeah. Or to ask for help.
Or to ask for help. Yeah, and so, but I'm hearing, this kind of incommensurability between this profession that often works against these engaging in deeper, complex ways of knowing.
I was just wondering what your experience has been when you talk to teachers and trying to get them to approach this idea of Latino communities as being very diverse instead of this homogenous group. Because I feel like in my experience there's been just a tendency to think of them as this way, and if you approach it this way then you'll be more successful. Or how have the teachers reacted in your community?
Well, I can talk about, so I'm doing the community study right now, and it'd be good to talk about that. But I also wanted to comment, actually, yesterday I went with Stanton to Norristown to talk with teachers, and I don't expect, I guess I get sometimes just shocked at first, right? Like with the conversation, and a little bit taken aback, because it does, again, the teachers we talk to, and they're fantastic teachers, caring teachers who are very much appreciated by Latino families. But there was I don't know, noticed, Stanton, there were various instances where the conversation goes into describing Latino families, whether it's, and again, wanting to know, wanting to have an explanation for things, whether it's, okay, this is the way it is between Latino parents and the children who translate, and this is how they feel. so coming to that conclusion, whereas that's just one experience, right? There are many different experiences for translators. Many children kind of thrive with that responsibility, and other children have a very hard time, and they experience these kind of differential power relations with their parents. And then, of course, that's all wound up in what it means to speak Spanish and what it means to speak English in this society. But, I mean, that's one example where a teacher said one thing, this is how it is. This is the issue and the problem. This is how it's experienced. And then in another occasion, I think we were also talking about the same topic, but a teacher said, parents don't talk to their kids at home. That's the problem. And so again, these could be true, right? But I guess this is something that I experience, right? Every time I go and talk with teachers, and again, teachers are trying to understand, right? They're trying to think about how to make sense of Latino families, and so you kind of grab on to any little bit of information that you have, and then it becomes the truth, right? The real. And so I know I struggle with that as I go into schools and talk with teachers. And I don't know if you noticed this, Stanton, I emphasize dialogue, right? I said, well, that's a good topic to dialogue about with parents. So I struggle with that. So I compared 1996, right, and that scene in a trailer park in North Carolina with that same scene kind of happening over and over as I go into classrooms. And again, by fantastic teachers. I mean, not, these are all great teachers and leaders. And it's interesting in the community in Ithaca, actually the college town in Ithaca. Well, Ithaca, I call it college town as a pseudonym, but I'll just say Ithaca. The teachers are coming to know, I mean, there's this language of anti-racism, a language of social justice, a language of equity. And there are groups of teachers that are thinking about equity with these words and with these terms. And so they're so in my interviews with these teachers, I'm getting these stories of these teachers coming, the stories of racial consciousness, how they came to understand the issues, and how they come to understand families, right? And these are really great interviews. But that's the language that those teachers are using. On the other hand, and they're very excited, right? Because this is something new. Their eyes are opened to inequity, and they're interrogating themselves racially and culturally, and they're doing all this work on themselves. Which is fantastic. And so I juxtapose like interviews with those teachers who are kind of excited, right? Coming into this racial consciousness, with veteran African American teachers and educational leaders, who are saying, "Well, you guys get all excited. We still have, huge disparities in educational achievement." And this is how it's been, cycle after cycle, like years after years after years, decade after decade, the same stories of exclusion and educational inequities, right, for our kids. So, kind of trying to put these together, right, these stories of these teachers coming to racial consciousness, multicultural consciousness, and then African American parents who are saying, "Oh, it's the same." Hey, don't get so excited. Like, well, you're coming to consciousness, and we've always known this, right? We've always known this, and so those are different kinds of knowing there that I can talk about. So.
Would you say that what you just described right here, that tension, that would be like one of the dangers of knowing, or like one of the, it's definitely a consequence that doesn't come off in a very positive light, right, of knowing. Mm-hmm. And this is still sort of forming in my head, sorry, so I can maybe follow. I'm also just trying to think of like some other consequences or maybe dangers that could come about from this practice or approach of knowing. And I'm thinking specifically to something that I read written by Ladson Billings about, I think a particular teacher. She was white and she was very successful teaching black students. And Ladson Billings says it's because she is culturally black, which I found really, really striking and startling. I think I'm still processing that, but then I'm wondering how knowing or a practice of knowing informs a white teacher being culturally black.
Because she's not knowing so like different from my teachers who are maybe coming to racial consciousness almost in a vacuum. And in conversations, I mean, they're excited about what their fellow African American teachers and leaders can teach them. I mean, it seems like that because that teacher is in context, right? She's living there. She's
I almost look at it as like living through knowing or living near knowing. What do you think of that? Like personifying or knowing.
So I mean, that teacher doesn't need the social justice rhetoric, right? Like she's engaged in the community, right? And that doesn't necessarily, grant someone expertise knowing a community. Of course, people from the same communities can come and say different things about members of that community. But yeah, it seems it's not rhetoric. It's a living. I don't know enough about that teacher. But that's the kind of, I guess, knowing through experience and engagement. I think that open up possibilities. Yeah, but you're saying there's a danger?
Well, perhaps. I don't know. I'm still just
Yeah, I
trying
mean,
to
there could
work
be
it
there.
out.
I think the tensions are in all of these. I mean, part of it is, there's no, not to say there's an answer, but just to bring up, okay, these are the tensions in all of this. And that even, as I'm saying, working with teachers with a social justice lens who are interested in learning about, and who are, practice culturally responsive teaching, it's in their language, to recognize that that's still a particular kind of knowing. I want to call attention to a book. Well, it's not a book yet. I just read the manuscript. Andrea Droines, she did a study with Latina mothers and looking at their involvement in the small school reform movement in Fruitvale, in Oakland, California. And so, but she describes this process where both, the reform movement was really the catalysts were teachers, and teachers who talked about, well, we want to do this because it's the right thing. This promotes equity. This alleviates the inequitable educational outcomes and achievement for our students. And they have the social justice perspective, and they name it, right? That's a goal. And so then Andrea documents how that perspective, completely ignores parents' perspectives. And so while parents are asking, what's the social justice goal? And so they explain it to them. And then the parents say, well, what about us? And what we know, and what, right? So there's this disconnect between that social justice perspective from, again, good teachers that are making good things happen, and these parents. And then these parents were also disowned by the movement people who were local activists, right? Because these parents were doing research. They were doing interviews, right? They were trying to they were complaining about that this school reform movement doesn't include them. So they're going to engage in, interviewing folks and getting the real story. And so then the school reform, the community organizing folks got very angry with the mothers, right? You're not acting, we need the angry parent. We need organizing and protesting. We don't need research. We don't know you as intellectuals, right? We know you as protesters, not as intellectuals. And so, see, this is tricky terrain here. And that's what I'm just trying to call attention to. Not that I have answers, but just, these are the terrains that we're moving.
So I think we should wrap up.
Mhm.
Thanks very much,
Okay,
Sophia.
thank you.